All right, everybody, we're rolling into the last unit of content here. So exam 3 is behind us. As I mentioned before, the previous units that led up to exams kind of had common themes. This is just everything else. So we start with what will probably be close to a 2-day lecture. For some reason, it doesn't take a full 2 days. I'll roll into the next stuff on Monday, but we're rolling into plyometric speed and agility. So normally I kind of let the notes be the guide here. You obviously have these notes. I'm gonna do a little bit differently today. And what I'm gonna do today is use this presentation I created, appears to be 12 years ago, on a related topic. So just a little backstory here, and then we'll dive into it. I gave this presentation at one of the Minnesota meetings for the National Strength and Conditioning Association back in 2013. And it's actually when I hosted the clinic, I hosted it here at St. Scholastica, and I actually gave it in this exact same room. So I had a bit of a home field advantage. For something like that, the topic that I presented on was upper body plyometrics. That's not what we're going to spend all of our time the next 2 days talking about, upper body plyometrics. It is an area that a lot of people don't talk about. When you talk about plyometrics, typically you're talking about lower body plyometrics and jumping sorts of movements. But a lot of this presentation, especially in the beginning, just talks about the background of what are plyometrics, what is the science that underlies plyometrics. And so I didn't really feel a need to reinvent the wheel. So I'm going to use the same presentation. I've added a couple things since then, but for the most part, this is the presentation I gave. And it generally covers everything on the first page of notes there. So I'm going to go through the presentation. If I feel a need to circle back to something in the notes, I will, but it just makes the most sense to do it this way. So our subject is plyometric speed and agility. Most of what we're going to talk about today is going to be plyometrics, but definitely speed is intimately connected to plyometrics and maybe to a lesser degree agility, but let's dive into it here. In terms of where plyometrics find their origin, I do sometimes like to share the history and origin stories of some of the things that we talk about here. And if you were to look up plyometrics and where they started, you'd see the name Yuri Verkhoshansky, which the name may have come up in this class before, but that's a famous name in the history of the science of strength training. Um, and so he was the one that really is credited with popularizing the idea of plyometrics. So that was not his term. He did not create that word. That's more of an American word once it kind of migrated to the United States. More on how that happened in a little bit. But early 1960s, so this is not something people were talking about in the 1950s, the 1910s, things like that. And originally, if you were to translate from Russian to English, you would have seen the shock method being kind of the original version of this. And some of what people are doing when they're doing their modern day plyometrics is exactly what the shock method used to be years ago. Do not worry about the terms plyometric versus plyometric versus power metric. It was in my presentation. I'm not worried about you worrying about that here. So you can totally ignore those terms. We're simply talking about collectively plyometrics. And in terms of when plyometrics started to become a little bit more widely known, I don't remember the year. It somewhere 1960s, 1970s. That's not important. But a coach for the American track and field team, so the U.S. team, Fred Wilt was his name. He was he may still be alive, was a successful runner in his own right, but then became a coach. And as he was observing the Soviet athletes warming up for, let's say, a track meet, and maybe it might have been a big championship or something like that, he was observing them doing a lot of jumping movements as part of their warm up, as opposed to what were the U.S. runners doing, or just the members of the track and field team. They were doing a lot of kind of that stretching and static holds and sitting on the ground and doing those sorts of things, whereas the Soviet athletes were doing something very different, these jumping sorts of movements, and then started to question, is there something to that in terms of connecting that in the warm-up to their performance? And that really then opened the door for what we know as plyometrics to migrate to the West, and kind of our understanding and our implementation and refining of this idea that we call plyometrics. And he might have been, Fred Wilt might have been, it's so W-I-L-T, Wilt, Fred Wilt. He might have been the one, I think, that created the name plyometrics. Um, and I think in retrospect, he didn't necessarily like the name, but it's what stuck and still sticks today. But everybody refers to what we're going to talk about in the next couple of days as plyometrics. So that's just a little bit of the history and origin story of plyometrics. And these are some of the early observations from people that were studying these sorts of things, whether they were coaches or scientists and researchers. And these are some things that maybe you have a little bit of experience in some of the testing that maybe you've been learning as part of physiological assessment, for example. But let's take three different examples, and they all involve jumping as high as you can possibly jump, and presumably a way we can accurately measure how high you're jumping. So exhibit one, you stand upright, you dip down, and then you jump as high as you can. We would call that a counter movement jump. And that's very similar to probably what you've learned in the vertical jump test in physiologic assessment. And the person jumps however high in centimeters, as illustrated in this bar graph below each image there. Exhibit two, the person what's the difference here? Dips down, what's going on? Dips down, jumps up, lands, and then jumps again. So jumps, lands, and then jumps again, as opposed to just dip and jump. See the difference there? They went higher that time. They jumped higher as a result of that. And then exhibit three, and this is actually what the shock method is. Like this is, Yuri Verkhoshansky's, origin of plyometrics. The shock method would be what you maybe know as a depth jump today in plyometrics. So the person starts on an elevated surface, steps off, hits the ground, and then attempts to jump as high as possible after hitting the ground. And you can see that they jumped the highest in that third situation. And you can see in each case, it's basically an increasing preload, so to speak, or loading in terms of the force involved. And so these observations started to get some people's attention. And my guess is it was these early observations that then started to form what we know today as plyometrics. And this simply is just looking at how high can somebody jump. And this would be very reproducible. I mean, every one of you, it should apply if your intent in all three different situations was to truly jump as high as you could. You should jump the highest in that third situation where you're starting on an elevated surface, stepping off, hitting the ground, and then trying to reverse that as quickly as possible and jump as high as you can. So plyometrics, where does it find its role in exercise and training programs? I would say you're a lot more likely to see plyometrics in training programs. And when we say training program versus exercise program, there's some subtle implications going on to the surface. So when you say a training program, you're generally suggesting we're talking about athletics and performance as opposed to exercise, which might be health and fitness. We don't necessarily worry about those semantics here today. But the point is, do you see plyometrics in a lot of people's exercise programs when their goals are related to general health and fitness? No, you don't. Could you? Sure, you could. But nothing in the ACSM guidelines talks about what is the frequency of plyometric training that you should prescribe to your clients or your patients, and intensity and duration. The word plyometric might not even show up in the entire book, Guidelines for Exercise Testing and Prescription. But it certainly shows up in a lot of contexts characterized by training and athletic performance, particularly when power is involved. And you can probably find examples of sports that power really isn't involved to a great degree, but they would be the exceptions and not the rule. Power comes up a lot in a lot of different sports. So why do we put plyometrics into training? I mean, number one, there could be a specificity to it, like these jumping sorts of movements and landing and then jumping, and that might be part of the sport of the activity. So then specificity applies. But probably more likely, it's a means by which to increase one's speed or power or quickness. And those are physical qualities that often play into performance and success. When it comes to plyometrics, you generally want to be thinking about is the person strong enough to be able to do these things and A, get something out of it, and B, do it safely? Because we're talking about power, doing things explosively, maybe ballistically. Strength very much is going to have to be the base of all of that. Because if you're not strong enough, you're going to crumple underneath those very, very high loads, forces that you're having to absorb. For example, stepping off of an elevated surface like this desk right here, stepping off, hitting the ground, and then jumping as high as you possibly can. You've got to be strong enough, strength, to be able to absorb that when you hit the floor there. And that's going to be multiple times your body weight. Take your body weight, multiply it by 1.5, 2, 3 times, to depend on the surface height, and you've got to be able to absorb that when you hit the ground and then reverse it. If you don't have the strength in your legs, you're going to crumple underneath that force and nothing's going to happen. So depending on how intense the plyometrics are, strength needs to be the base. And you've heard this before somewhere else, and that was generally the power training, and more specifically the Olympic lifts. So this is a common theme that comes up in power training, especially when the intensity is pretty high, and it can get really high in plyometrics. So we have to think about not putting the cart before the horse and having an appropriate degree of strength as the base to be able to support these higher power outputs and absorbing forces as well. When we talk about plyometrics, typically it involves jumping movements. Like if you've done plyometric exercise before for sport, and many of you have, it probably involves some kind of a jump, jumping on and off things primarily, maybe, kind of bounding side to side, back and forth, but it involved jumping, which involved an explosive kind of powerful acceleration and a release at the end. That's important. There was a release. You were releasing from the ground in a jump. You've probably, some of you, done more upper body related plyometric, maybe not more compared to lower body, but some of you have probably done things that involve throwing something as high as you can or as far as you can. That's very much a plyometric action, but it involved a release, releasing the ball from the hand, for example. Stretch shortening cycle training, so SSC, stretch shortening cycle, typically means one thing in our world, and that's stretch shortening cycle. And there's actually a couple different things going on in the stretch shortening cycle, but for now we can leave it there. So this is the top part of your notes here, kind of defining what the stretch shortening cycle is. And there's 3 components. These are terms you've heard before, but 3 distinct phases. There's the eccentric, so the muscles are being lengthened. So that would be in, like, let's say, a jumping movement, the lowering phase, as you're dipping down, the counter movement part. That's phase 1, the eccentric. Phase 3, jumping ahead, skipping a step. That's going to be the concentric, the shortening of the muscle. In the case of a counter movement jump, the jumping, propelling yourself up off the ground. And that's generally what it's all about in the end. And then there's that phase 2, which is called the amortization phase, which is that transition in between. There has to be some kind of transition, changing direction, going from eccentric to concentric. Technically, there's got to be a pause there if you're going from eccentric to concentric, but that pause is often on the order of milliseconds. You're intentionally trying not to pause too long. And there's important physiological reasons for that we'll get into a little bit later here. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get more out of that concentric phase. And I'll give you the example that I may have given you before. Your goal is to jump as high as you possibly can, in like a vertical jump test, for example. Exhibit A, you dip down to a certain point, hold it for 3 seconds, and then jump as high as you can and swat at those flags on the Vertec device. See how high you get. Exhibit B, dip down to the exact same point, the same depth, the same knee angle, but do not pause it at all. Reverse it as quickly as you can possibly reverse it, and then jump as high as you can. In every single case, you will jump higher where that transition was very, very short. I mean, what gives? You went to the same different position, the same depth. The only difference is I paused it for 3 seconds on one, and I didn't pause at all on the other one. This is attempting to exploit the 2 primary mechanisms of the stretch shortening cycle. One is more of a neurophysiological component, a reflex, And the other was more like a mechanical and what's going on with elastic energy and how can we recoup that. And we'll talk about those more later on, but that's what's going on and that's how it works. And you know this. You don't have to be taught that. When you were kids growing up and jumping, you just innately knew that the longer I pause and hold it at the bottom, the less high I'm going to jump. And we see it come up in all kinds of activities and sports. Whether it's something where there's a windup involved, where we're throwing a ball or swinging a club, jumping as high as we can, to more strength-based things like bench pressing as much as you can or squatting as much as you can. And it comes up in running all the time, especially sprinting. Like sprinting by definition is just repeated plyometric actions. In all of these cases, whether you're winding up to throw a fastball or swing a golf club or whatever else, you're not holding it in that transition period very long. Because if you are, you're losing out on some of the concentric on the other end. You're not cocking back your arm, holding it for a couple seconds, and then throwing it. It's a relatively short transition, just like if I asked you all, let's see what your 1 rep max bench press is or 1 rep max squat. And again, do the same experiment you did with the vertical jump. Bring the bar down to your chest in the bench press, hold it for 3 seconds, and then press it up and see how much you can do that way versus what people in the gym call the touch and go. Bring it down and reverse it as fast as you can. People would say, well, but that's bouncing the bar off your chest. It's not bouncing the bar off the chest at all. I understand that's why people, that's what they think it is, but it's taking advantage of stretch shortening cycles, what it's doing. And that's why every single one of you will bench press more with a touch and go than a pause at the chest. Same thing with a back squat. This is my favorite family picture here. Sadly, we lost Daisy a year ago, so it's kind of painful to look at it, but this is Daisy right here. Lily is still with us. I love this picture. And this picture, I'm going somewhere with this, not just a random thing to put in here. So there be Sean Frises, loves of my life, little small dogs. And they like to know what's going on. They like to see everything. So they're always up on everything. And in our house, they're allowed to be on absolutely anything. Some people have very specific rules about what the pets can do. They can be up on anything in our house. It's actually encouraged. But when you watch them jump, and I watched every little thing they ever did, not because I was doing a research experiment and taking notes, but you watch them jump, they do the same thing. There's a counter movement. They dip a little bit and they rapidly reverse it, and then they jump. Was it a matter of when they first came to us, I sat down and explained to them, listen, Daisy and Lily, if you want to jump higher, you need to have this little dip and don't pause it, just rapidly reverse it and then jump. Of course, if they would have understood what I was saying, I would have done it, but we didn't have that conversation. They figured it out. So in the animal kingdom, you see this. Animals know it. We know it. You weren't explained when you were a kid that, well, here's this thing called the stretch shortening cycle, and we got to think about the muscle spindles and the elastic energy stored in tendons and all. So phase, all these 3 phases and everything else concept, you just figured it out. Like it's figured out in the animal kingdom, and it's a real thing. A real thing is also the pumpkins that I grow. This is like a 3-for-1 slide right here. I wasn't kidding when I said I take pumpkin growing pretty seriously. I'm not real good at it compared to the serious people, but boy, they sure look pretty there around Halloween time. They look good. I like those shapes that year. They weren't real huge, but I liked them. That was the next year. We got bigger that year. My goal was I want to break 100 pounds. And I will tell you, in the world of competitive pumpkin growing, and it's a real thing, 100 pounds is nothing. You know what the world record is for a pumpkin? The world record. I think it's like 2,700 pounds. 2,700 pounds, give or take. You know where that world record was set? Anoka, Minnesota. It was somewhere else for the longest time, maybe Germany or something. But then last year, high school science teacher from Anoka, or 2 years ago, broke the world record at 2,700 pounds. And like it's a real thing. Like it's not like only 3 people do it. It's a huge deal. So my 100-pound pumpkins are absolutely nothing to them, but for me, it was good enough. My goal was a 100-pound pumpkin. I think I got 7 that year, and there they are pictured right there. And of course, I'm going to weigh it. You know me well enough to know, like, I need proof. I need to know how the thing is. So I'm going to put on my certified scale, and there's a sticker. It's certified. It's legit. 148 pounds. There you go. How about that? I stopped doing the really big ones after that year because it was way too stressful for me. Like, how's it stressful? It's like the people that do it competitively, it's a full-time job. It's more than raising a child. Like it's full days and like everything's got to just be perfect and you can't even imagine. So it really stressed me out. And a thunderstorm comes, there's hail, like it ruined the whole thing. So like I got tired of being so anxious about that kind of stuff. So the next year I just went to like the smaller ones and that was good. And this was supposed to be another family picture, but one of the children weren't cooperating. So that made me really frustrated. I just walked away and Rachel snuck out later and took this very nice picture under a rainbow. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it. But anyway, coming back to the topic at hand, stretch shortening cycle, 2 primary mechanisms. What's going on? We don't really question that if you rapidly reverse those movements and that transition between eccentric and concentric, we don't question that you're going to get more out of the concentric. You're going to jump higher. You're going to lift more weight. So what's causing that? And it's a real thing. It's not a placebo effect. It's not something between our ears. 2 things going on. Number one, there's a mechanical component. And that's basically something going on with stored elastic energy in elastic structures as part of the muscle, tendon, bone unit. And they call it the series elastic component, more on that in a little bit. And then there's the neurophysiological, and these are neural reflexes. And when you learned in an anatomy class and maybe in exercise physiology in the fall, we talk about muscle spindles. It might have been, it's just another anatomy thing that we have to learn and doesn't really have any application, kind of like those Golgi tendon organs. It actually does. And here is exactly where those muscle spindles come in and potentially play a role in something like performance. They are key to this whole thing, the stretch shortening cycle and plyometrics and where the value is. So the series, don't worry about that definition. It's like one definition from a dictionary there. We'll look a little bit more at this, but the series elastic component basically means those elastic structures that when stretched, store energy elastically, energy that then can be recouped on the shortening phase if the transition isn't too long. So we look at the muscle tendon unit, MTU is what we often abbreviate this as. And we have what's called the parallel elastic component. So you learn terms like the epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, sarcolemma. Those are all things that are kind of laying in parallel with each other, not just joined end to end. There's some elasticity within those particular anatomic structures. So like connective tissue, we're thinking, but it's not usually where the majority of this elastic energy is stored and then released in something like a plyometric action. We then have the series elastic component, elements that are actually like kind of end-to-end connected, or we would say in series, tendon being the major one in terms of where the majority of this elastic energy is stored when lengthened, because when the muscle is lengthened, eccentric, the tendon is also lengthened. Not a lot, not a huge amount, but remember I told you a story about I'm going to drink tea with an Englishman when I go to England? That's why they sent me over there to spend 2 weeks to learn how they measured tendon and how much tendon lengthens. And it does. It doesn't lengthen like as much as a rubber band does, but it lengthens. You can measure it with an ultrasound, and that's what they did. And I observed them doing that primarily with knee extension. You put the ultrasound probe right over the tendon, and you can measure how long it lengthens. Things like cross bridges, myofilaments, et cetera. Yeah, technically series elastic, a little bit of elasticity, but not major amounts. Tendon is underlined and bolded for a reason. That's where the majority of the elastic energy is stored. And then we have within the muscle tendon unit what we call the contractile component, the contractile elements. This is where like force is generated, the interaction between the actin and the myosin and the cross bridges and all the things you learn somewhere else. So we look at this image here. Here's our series elastic component. Primarily, you're thinking tendon. Parallel elastic component. That'd be like the connective tissue, like I said, epimysium, endomysium, perimysium, sarcolemma, et cetera. And then your contractile elements in here. So if we look at something like the lower leg and the ankle calf complex here, here's our contractile elements. So that's within the muscle, and that's where the actin and the myosin are interacting with each other, cross-bridge cycling, force production. The series elastic component is going to be, in this case, primarily the tendon, because remember, the muscle creates the force. That force is transmitted tensily in a pulling fashion to the tendon. That's connected on the other end to the bone. That's where the movement actually happens. But collectively, we call this the muscle tendon unit, and it does act as a unit. One element doesn't come without the other. So contribution of the series elastic modes. We haven't got to the neurophysiological part yet, the muscle spindles, and we got more to say on that. But if we're just looking at the series elastic component, again, think tendon because primarily it's tendon. One estimate said that when we look at, let's say, the difference between a counter movement and a non-counter movement jump, that was the first example I gave you to think about today, which is dip down, hold it for several seconds, and then jump. That's the non-counter movement versus dip down to the same position, but rapidly transition and jump as high as you can. That's the counter movement jump. And we see what's the difference in height between the two that you jumped if you gave a maximal effort in both. And according at least to one research study, 20 to 30% of that difference comes from simply the elastic energy recouped from tendons, where it was initially stored when the tendon was stretched in the eccentric component. So all of that is to say that tendon is thought to be the primary contributor when it comes to elastic energy in this series elastic component. So this is one of the two things that explains why you jump higher with the counter movement and the rapid reversal than when you dip down and you hold it. One of the two major things. The second being the muscle spindles. When you learn about muscle spindles and you will learn about Golgi tendon organs, probably in the fall, they collectively fall into a category probably called proprioceptors. They're considered a proprioceptor. Proprioceptors, among other things, relay information to us about our body's position in space and movement and joint positions, things like that. So they are proprioceptors. I'll show you a picture in the next slide here. But muscle spindles actually live within a particular type of skeletal muscle fiber. And I don't know if you've heard this distinction yet. And I think I did mention at the top of the class at the beginning of the semester here, the difference between intrafusal and extrafusal muscle fibers. So when you think muscle fibers and actin and myosin and contraction and force development, everything up until now, you've probably thought of that as like the only muscle fiber situation. And those are extrafusal muscle fibers. But technically, that's not the only thing going on within skeletal muscle. We do have things called intrafusal muscle fibers, which are specialized fibers housing these proprioceptors, like muscle spindles. Muscle spindles are proprioceptors are going to be very, very sensitive to stretch. A, how much stretch is happening, and B, just as important, maybe more importantly, how rapidly is the stretch happening? So if I want to know something about how much is a muscle stretching and how fast is it stretching, where would I put a proprioceptor to sense something like that? I put it within the muscle fibers themselves. So these intrafusal muscle fibers are kind of woven seamlessly among the extrafusal muscle fibers, which is what you think of as a muscle fiber, the contractile machinery, etc. So we talked about Golgi tendon organs the other day, and we said, they're going to be more sensitive to like force and tension. Muscle spindles are more sensitive to stretch and rate of stretch. So if the muscle spindles interpret this was a very rapid stretch, so you can kind of think of muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs as kind of like self-defense mechanisms to prevent against injury. And we talked about the GTOs and what they might prevent. But muscle spindles, if they sense this very rapid stretch of a muscle, that then signals this might be a problem. Like this rapid stretch, if it continues on unabated, might cause tissue damage. So the muscle is rapidly stretching, therefore the reflexive action from the muscle spindles is going to cause shortening. Lengthening is the problem or the potential problem. We need to shut that down. So we need to cause the muscles to contract or shorten. A couple pictures here. So you've all been to the doctor probably, where they're doing a physical exam or something, and they take the rubber mallet and they tap on the knee, the patella. And it might take them a couple times to hit just the right spot. But once they do, your knee's going to jerk. It's going to rapidly extend. And you can't stop it. No matter how much you will yourself not to do it. And I say, here's a briefcase with $1 million in cash, and it's all yours tax-free. If you cannot extend your knee when you get hit in that spot with that hammer, you cannot override it. That's what we call a reflex. Nothing you can do about it. Why do they do it? They do it because if your knee doesn't extend when they hit the right spot, something's wrong. Something's wrong with a reflex, which means there might be something more significantly wrong. And those of you that are going into physical therapy, for example, you'll learn all about reflexes, and certain reflexes are supposed to show up at certain times after, somebody is born, and like certain time periods that this reflex needs to be in place, and if it's not, and all those sorts of things way beyond our scope here. But the point is, what's going on with that so-called knee-jerk reaction is they hit the right spot, and that causes a rapid stretching of some of the musculature of the knee extensor muscles. So the message being received is, this muscle's been stretched rapidly. This is a problem. If we don't stop it, we're going to stop it by actually reversing it and causing a quick contraction. And there's your knee extending or jerking. So it's the muscle spindles that are being triggered with that rapid stretch that's, let's say, that eccentric, and that very, very short transition between the two. And that's the second explanation on why you get a little bit more out of that concentric action on the other side of it, the jumping, the concentric to phase 3. So exploiting the stretch shortening cycle, it's a natural, that it happens in everybody. So it's not like, well, it's cheating if you do that. You can't do that because that helps in performance. No, it's a part of human movement. It's to your advantage to take advantage of and exploit this natural reflex. Important is going to be the transition time, that phase to that amortization phase. You need it to be as short and as quick as possible if you're going to get the most out of it. And when it comes to, and this was from 2013, I don't think these numbers have changed, so we're going to go with them. And for any purposes in the future in this class, let's just remember this number here, 250 milliseconds. That's kind of the threshold. If it's greater than 250 milliseconds, which is how much of a second, by the way? 250 milliseconds is how much of a second? If it makes sense the way I phrased that. Quarter of a second. 1,000 milliseconds would be 1 second. Quarter of a second. That's pretty fast, like quarter of a second. If it's longer than that, that's considered long stretch shortening cycle. Too long to maximally be able to exploit the stretch shortening cycle. So we see this often when there's a really large angular displacement of the involved joints. So something like a block jump in volleyball, which, not being a volleyball player, and if anybody is, you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but a block jump would be you're dipping down and you're maybe by the net, and your job is maybe block a shot that's coming your way. You're kind of dipped down in kind of a deeper position, waiting for when that shot comes and you have to jump. So you're sitting there holding it for a period of time. You're losing any effect you would have got from that stretch shortening cycle, but there's nothing you can do about it. The situation warrants that you kind of sit there and you wait and you hold it, and then you jump and you react to it. Versus a short stretch shortening cycle, smaller angular displacement of the involved joints. Think your counter movement jump for your vertical jump test. None of you for that vertical jump test guarantee it, and you weren't taught it. You figured out when you were given the instructions, dip down and then jump up as high as you can. None of you dipped way down very deep, guaranteed, because you knew from a long time that you weren't going to jump as high. You dip down only a little bit. There's a relatively small angular displacement of the knees. So for example, that example, taking off into a jump. And the transition is very, very short. If it's too long, and this is why your 1 rep max in the bench press will always be less if you do a pause at your chest. If it's too long, that elastic energy that's stored in the series elastic component gets lost as heat. So you're not going to be able to take advantage of that. And the potentiating ability of the muscle spindles is also lost. It's negated. I mean, you're still going to be able to produce a lot of force and lift the weight or jump or do whatever you're going to do. It's just not going to be as much because you're not getting that elastic energy kind of recoil and recouping that. And you're losing the potentiating ability from the muscle spindles, that neural reflex. So this is a lot of what it kind of underlies plyometrics and why people do plyometrics and why plyometrics by definition are explosive and powerful. And you're trying to minimize ground contact time when you're jumping on and off things. We've already talked a little about post-activation potentiation, but I don't think I've shown you these figures yet, so it's worth talking about. So this is from research a long, long time ago, but actually from that book I passed around several weeks ago, I said, this is like the really heavy duty stuff. This is where you want to go down all the rabbit holes in the science of strength training. This is the book, and nobody reads this book cover to cover. That's probably how I described it. This comes from that book, and there's a name we've already seen today, Yuri Verkhoshansky. Old, prior research. So what they were looking at is they were looking at, and I can only interpret from what I saw in the text there, but my suspicion is they were laying on their back, doing like a supine medicine ball throw. So imagine you're like laying on a bench and you've got a medicine ball and your goal is just push that ball as far up as you possibly can push it. So what they did is they would have had the participants just do that, no preconditioning, just lay down, you push that ball up as high as you possibly can, and they can measure how high the ball goes. Pretty simple. And then at some point thereafter, like pretty shortly thereafter, they had everybody do a few sets of pretty heavy. I mean, 80% isn't like super heavy, I know, but heavy-ish bench presses. A similar movement. It's not throwing a medicine ball as high as you can, but the movement is generally the same as this kind of chest pressing thing. 3 sets of 3 reps of 80%. And then that was followed by, after 10 minutes of rest, they did the same throw thing again. So they kind of had the baseline. How high could you throw this from a supine position without any preconditioning or pre-stimulus? Do the heavy loaded bench press, same general kind of movement pattern, but under heavier load, slower movement, fewer repetitions. And then do the exact same thing and throw as high as you can. And what they saw was a pretty significant difference in the height that those medicine balls got thrown on the second try. Again, the thing that came in between the two throwing bouts was this preconditioning stimulus, which is 3 sets of 3 reps of, I say heavy bench press, but 80% isn't heavy for most people. And that was a pretty significant increase right there. That is post-activation potentiation, a beautiful example of how it works. And this is just some data that comes from the same study there. And that would go back to 1977, quite a long time ago. And that's what contrast training or contrast loading was. And it came up in this particular lecture because a lot of times the power exercise, remember, you were pairing 2 things. You were pairing, this was back in I think it'd be advanced. This would have been the advanced second thing. You were pairing 2 different exercises together. One was more of a heavier load, slower movement, kind of strength-based, a bench press or a squat. That was paired with a very powerful movement where the pattern was kind of the same, like a bench throw with a ball or a jump or something like that. And we talk about that as contrast training, because usually the power exercise involves something that was a plyometric kind of movement or action. Doesn't have to be by definition, but oftentimes it is. So that was the reason that I started talking about post-activation potentiation and contrast training. We've talked about it. We don't need to spend a ton more time on it. This was just me at the time kind of talking about, you've already seen this article, so we don't need to worry about that. If you wanted to dig in more to it, this is where I would direct you to. When we look at peak power production, it's interesting that if your goal is, and you can measure power in something like watts or however you can objectively measure power production, it's usually with loads that are pretty light. It's not with 80%, 90%, 100% loads. It's usually where the load as a percent of 1 rep max is pretty small. 30% according to this chart here, which if you read the description of the chart, that's a theoretical example between the two. But the point is, if your goal is to maximize power production, the loads are usually pretty light because you run into a problem when the loads get heavy, you can't move them very fast. And remember how power is defined: force times distance divided by time. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle or towards the lower end there. So people are doing power training sorts of things. Generally, loads are pretty light, but the power is very, very high as a result. It also explains why during an Olympic lift in Olympic weightlifting, for example, if you were to compare power outputs, and you can do this, compare the power output of somebody doing a clean and jerk versus the power output of somebody doing a back squat. The clean and jerk, I mean, when you look at what somebody can clean and jerk versus what somebody can back squat, and they've trained really hard on both of them, their back squat's going to be much, much higher than a clean and jerk. So you think, wow, that load is a lot higher. But that clean and jerk with that lower load, the power is much, much, much higher than it was in that thing that initially you looked at and said, that was impressive. They can squat 800 pounds, but they can only clean and jerk 350 pounds. The power is much higher in that clean and jerk. And powerlifting as a sport is the most inappropriately named thing in the world because it is the least powerful. They're very slow. They're heavyweights, but they're very slow. Olympic weightlifting should have been called powerlifting, but in the 1950s, when names started sticking, power back then meant like strength. So when they said powerlifting, we call this new sport powerlifting, they meant strength lifting. And now that we think about power very, very differently, especially in our world of exercise physiology, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but the name's stuck and we have what we have. But there's your little history lesson for today. So plyometrics typically involve lower body jumping types of movements. Again, a release happening at the end of it. But and here's where I kind of get more into the specifics of what this presentation was about. It was about, well, what do I think about like upper body plyometrics? There are sports and activities that require power and explosiveness of the upper body musculature. Yes, a lot of sports and activities require power from the legs and the hips. You can't really dispute that. But there are some that you'd be doing yourself a disservice as an athlete if you weren't doing some upper body plyometrics for training specificity purposes. So usually if we're talking about upper body stuff, we're talking about either explosively pushing the body away from something, as in like a clap push-up, for example, where you're going to do a push-up and you're pushing yourself up high enough where you can release from the ground, clap your hands, and get your hands back down the floor before you face plant. Just like jumping onto this table here, you can't do it slower than some minimal amount of power. Same thing with the clap push-up. But I can do a regular push-up as slow as I want to do it. Big difference there, but that involved a release of the body from the ground or a release from the hands of throwing something. And that's probably the more common way that upper body plyometrics are performed. The cautionary note is if you're going to do upper body plyometrics, obviously we got, a lot of power and explosiveness involved. You've got to keep in mind the associated joints, like for example, wrists. You can overdo it pretty quick. The wrist can take a real pounding on those sorts of things. And you look at the wrist, they're relatively small joints. They're not designed to be capable of dealing with huge loads like your ankles are, like your knees are, like your hips are, because for millions and millions of years, those joints had to deal with really big loads and power and explosiveness and all of that. The wrists, not nearly as much. So you can overdo it on the wrist pretty easily. You got to be careful if you're going to do a lot of the upper body stuff. So here be an example of just a snapshot of some plyometric sorts of activities. Those of you who have done plyometrics, you're probably familiar with things like either jumping on and off of boxes of various heights, or jumping over hurdles, or like one leg jumping over little small hurdles on the ground. A lot of stuff in that kind of plane of motion there. But something I'd encourage you to think about that I think often gets lost is this picture down here in the lower right. A, do you know what that's called? Very few people know what this exercise is called. It's a common one, but it's just something that may not have come up in your vocabulary up to this point, even if you were an athlete. Anybody know what that's called? I've only knows one thing. There's probably some people probably call it other things, but anybody know? That's the first question. We got more questions, but that's number one. What's that called? I've only ever known it as a Russian plyo. I'm not saying people don't call it other things because they probably do, but I've always known that as a Russian plyo. So that's the first question. Second question is why? Why would you do something like that? What kind of athlete would be doing something like that? Because what that person is doing right there, and it requires a particular apparatus where you've got these angled edges, and then you're just bounding back and forth like this. That's the only time I'm going to dance for you. I hope you caught it because it's not going to happen again. Who would care about something like that? Hockey is number one on my list because like those are the athletes I saw doing that all the time in the weight room at Marriott Arena, and these are men's, women's hockey players. University of Minnesota, the best in the country at the time. They did these all the time. But think about hockey, and I'm the furthest thing from saying knows anything about hockey, but I know it involves like putting skates on and being on the ice, and it's not like running and sprinting where it's all in this plane right here. There's a lot of side to side movement with the skating strike, and very powerful and very explosive. So why wouldn't you apply some principles of training specificity to that? Soccer has a lot of lateral movement to it. A lot of sports actually have a lot of lateral movement, not just lateral movement, but high power, explosive lateral movement. And if all you're ever doing is jumping on and off boxes, like that's all well and good, but it's also in one plane. So something to think about, just specificity wise. That's kind of an interesting one with plyometrics there. Pretty cool to see it being done. And the other thing with something like a Russian plyo is, anybody know what the other thing might be? Different than most plyometrics. That's going to make it even more intense. It's unilateral. Think about you jumping on all those boxes. It's 2 feet every single time. It's kind of distributing the load between the two legs. Now we're putting everything on one leg, unilateral. There's a weird intensity that comes with something like that, and difficulty and force. These are some examples I threw out there. Again, this was an upper body plyometrics lecture, but I talked about the clap push-up. Like, that's great. I mean, yeah, a clap push-up, already talked about what it means. You can see the picture there. Absolutely, by definition, that's an upper body plyometric exercise, but it's also pretty hard. You got to have a minimum amount of strength to be able to do one. It's kind of like a pull-up. Pull-ups are great if you have the minimum amount of strength, which is significant, to be able to pull yourself up one time and deal with your body weight. Kind of the same thing there. But you can adjust this a little bit. Just like in a pull-up, you can make yourself lighter. One thing, and one of the numerous advantages of something like elastic bands is you take a band and you kind of loop it underneath their torso there, you stand above them, and you lighten them as much as you need to lighten them to allow them to be able to get up high enough to get the benefit of kind of that explosiveness, that release from the ground, and then come back down. So they might not be strong enough to do it without assistance, so effectively lighten the body. And that's something very easy to do. There's an art to it. You got to know like how hard to pull and what to give them, but that would work. I put this up here because like this is cool. Like, yeah, if you're that strong and you're that explosive and powerful that you can start way down here at this, really, really deep and get yourself up high enough where you get your hands onto what looks like milk crates there, that's great. That's not the reason I put the picture up there. What's the reason I put the picture up there? Because that terrifies me. Because what's keeping those crates from sliding apart when your hands hit them? And if you want the recipe for a bilateral simultaneous pec tear, that seems to be it. So it's like, that might have been a photo shoot or something like that. I don't know. That scares me. I would never do something like that. But the one down here, so this is a name you've heard before, but that's Cal Dietz down at the University of Minnesota. A lot of what I've learned, especially in the advanced training world, I learned from him in that weight room. This was something he did with his athletes. So it's obviously a push-up. It's not a clap push-up. So what he's done is he's got himself in a squat rack here, a power rack. He's got these bands looping underneath his arms, and they're anchored at the top of the squat rack. These are actually really tall squat racks. He had basketball players in there too, so they were much taller than your average squat rack. But the point is, this is effectively lightening his body. And what he's going to do is he's going to try and explosively push himself up as high as he can. And he's going to go a lot higher when his body is lightened. And then he's going to come back down and reverse it. Kind of like stepping off here, hitting the ground and jumping back up. He's not going to be pausing. These are all going to be kind of like seamlessly linked together. As he comes back down, he's going to kind of absorb that force, get down, and then push up again as high as he can. That's a plyometric action. There's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And you can kind of play with, well, how hard do we want to make it / how much do we want to lighten your load by how thick are the bands and where are they anchored and stuff like that. But also notice his feet are on an elevated surface, which is going to add a degree of, not difficulty, but a degree of intensity. And he would do these for his athletes as part of an upper body plyometric activity. Great. Plenty of things are great. But again, keep in mind, like what's taking the brunt of a lot of that, the wrists and the hands. Like that's a lot on structures that aren't designed to be dealing with a lot of shock absorption, unlike your feet and your ankles and your knees and your hips. So that's kind of a cool one that anybody could probably do. Doesn't mean anybody should do it, but it doesn't take much to be able to do it. These are always interesting as kind of like edge of the map things that people do on YouTube. You can see any of it. And unfortunately with AI, it really clouds like what's actually real and what's just computer generated. So that's kind of the scourge of your generation is filtering out that kind of stuff. And it's impossible in some cases. But something like this, where this person, this is just a still image. I'm not going to click a button. It's going to turn into a video. But what this person did was they did a counter move, they dipped, and then they jumped up to the top of that stack of weights right there. I mean, you're pushing like the absolute limit of human ability. Somebody can jump that high. This person's vertical would have been, off the chart high. It's absolutely amazing. Like that height is almost as high as he is. It's also very, very risky. Go on YouTube and find all the times that good times went bad really quick and they didn't quite make it, or the stack fell out from underneath them or something like that and they wrecked themselves. But pretty amazing to see that. Equally amazing to be somebody that's going to start from a push-up position and push themselves up high enough to get their hands on these plates here. It's just kind of cool. Like the power's off the chart in cases like that. What about throws? Throwing things. There's a release. There's something in your hand, and your goal is to throw that thing out of your hands. In these cases, the person, and that's our same Cal Dietz as my model for these pictures, guys are writing an article on upper body plyometrics, and I needed some pictures to go in the article. So I asked him to do my model, and these are all things that I saw him do in that weight room. In one case, he's throwing a medicine ball here. In the other case, he's throwing a loaded barbell. Now, tell me what you think about that. Because I'll bet you've never seen it. I'll bet you've never done it. And you probably should never do it. And if you ever see it, you should be concerned that you saw it. Why? That's it. This is extremely high risk. This isn't throwing a medicine ball up in the air. This is throwing a loaded barbell, and your margin for error is almost nothing. Because the idea is you're going to throw it up, and then you're going to catch it, and you're going to reverse that, and you're going to do that a couple times in a row. I saw him do this with his athletes. This wasn't just, hey, this sounds like a cool idea. Let's do this for a picture, but this doesn't actually happen in reality. No, he did it. He did it with athletes. I watched him do it with his athletes. Does it change that it's a high risk because one of the most successful strength coaches around is doing it? No, all the risk is still there. He obviously understands the risk. He's going to try to minimize the risk, and he understands, he assumes the risk, meaning something goes wrong, liability's on him. He's the negligent one. He's the one getting sued. So he's got to really know what he's doing. The athletes have to really know what they're doing, and there have to be safeguards in place. So if something does go wrong, there's a safety net somewhere. I show this to you because I did see him do it. That bar is not loaded with a lot. Those are probably 10-kilogram plates. They're kind of worn down. They're old Alico bumper plates, but I think those are 10-kilogram plates. So round that to like 25-pound plates. Not a lot, 95 pounds roughly on a barbell. Relatively strong person can do that, no problem. But yeah, tons of risk. And so I bring it up because I took these pictures. I'm like, okay, I like these. I'm using these for the article. And when I went to submit the article, this was 2007, National Strength Conditioning Association's Performance Training Journal. So at that time, I was a regular columnist. So like every issue I wrote, my column was in the gym, and I wrote a different article every issue. This was one of them there, and I sent it in with those pictures, and they said, "We are not publishing this picture right here of that barbell bench press throw." And what was their explanation? We hate you and we hate Cal Dietz, so that's why we're not going to publish it. Why are they not going to let me publish that? Exactly. This is an organization, National Strength Conditioning Association. I mean, today has 60,000 members or certified professionals in like 70 or 80 countries. It has a wide audience. A lot of people are going to see that. They're like, well, this is in the NSCA journal, so they must endorse this. This must be the latest, greatest thing. We need to try this in the weight room on Monday morning. They're like, nope, no way. They didn't say it like that. They said it politely, but it's like, you can't have that picture in there. So I just lived with those two right there, and that was good enough. That was fine. Um, so kind of interesting, some people do, but understand if you do risky things or you have other people under your supervision do risky things, you assume the risk and all the liability. If something goes bad, it's all coming back on you. And welcome to a lot of the theme of some of the theme in our class in the fall, like legal issues. I'm gonna hit you really hard. I'm gonna hit you regularly because I want your radars ultra sensitive where all the risk is and the liability, so things don't happen to you. But things like supine throws, I mean, that's fine. The person's going to drop the medicine ball. It's not that heavy. Medicine balls don't get that heavy usually. I'm going to kind of drop. The person's going to kind of seamlessly in the act of kind of catch it, lowering the arms, bring it down, and then try and reverse it back up. There's our plyometric action, our phase 1, our phase 2, our phase 3. A couple potential problems with this is, number one, we need a partner, so there's extra resources involved. Number two, the medicine ball might be too light to really take advantage of it. When I did a lot of, not a lot, but there's a time when I was doing my contrast training, I would do medicine ball throws, and I'd use a 40-pound medicine ball. Like, that's a heavier kind of medicine ball. That was okay for the weight, but if it's like an 8 or 10 or 12-pound medicine ball like that, it's probably too light. And when you throw it, if you have any degree of strength and power, you're going to throw it so high that what are the chances you're going to throw that like perfectly straight up and it's going to come first perfectly straight down because that's what physics says it needs to do. Just a little bit of a deviation and send it up 20 feet over there. So just some potential issues that come with that. But in theory, all the pieces are in place for a nice little plyometric action. Some things that people do, and maybe you've done, they take medicine balls and they just start wailing them against things and throwing them, whether it's against the floor as hard as they can, over their head or backwards, or more of like a side twisting kind of thing against a wall. We talked about that at a different time as an example there. It's fine. Are all the three elements in terms of the phases there, short transition phase, then guess what? You have a plyometric action. And that might fit the bill in terms of your training specificity, et cetera. This was just an interesting picture that I saw. I put in this presentation. It got a lot of laughs. It's like, I don't know if people actually do that. I'm guessing those are martial artists, but all the ingredients are there. It's like, that's a plyometric action. You're probably not going to do it for various reasons, but it's like, no, okay, that's interesting. This gets into more like strong man, strong woman, and something called Highland Games, which preceded strongman by a long time. And that's like, one thing's called the sheaf toss, not the sheep, the sheaf, which is like a, I don't know technically what you define that is, but this little bale of something you're over a height, weight throw for height, the famous keg throw, and those are empty kegs, not full ones. Nobody throwing it that high. But all of these things, when they're winding up to do it, their goal is to get these things as high as they possibly can. So you kind of have this wind up where they're kind of swinging like this. And then there's the big one where here's phase 1, the eccentric, very short atomization phase 2, and then a violent phase 3, the concentric. And our goal is to get that as high as we possibly can. Those are all very upper body plyometric dominant sorts of things. Some injury considerations. So we're flipping the page now of the note. You're following along on the notes, and this presentation was not built with the notes, so it's not flowing smoothly. We need to think about injuries when we think about plyometric training, because we're talking about very high intensities, meaning very high lows. The durations are ultra short. Think about it. I'm going to step off this surface, I'm going to hit the floor, and then I'm going to try and minimize ground contact time, and then jump as high as I can. The duration is, I mean, fractions of a second maybe that the load was applied. But if I put a little force plate under there, I say step off of here, hit that force plate, and then jump as high as you can, it's going to measure multiple times your body weight in terms of the force. And let's just say it's double your body weight. Let's make it easy. And from this height, it's probably at least double your body weight when you hit the floor. How many of you can back squat double your body weight? Do the math right now. Simple math. Double body weight squat. It's not nearly as hard as double body weight bench. That's pretty rare air in the world of strength. But double body weight squat is no slouch either. How many of you can do that? That's a big load. If I put that bar on your back right now and say, go squat, double your body weight, a lot of you wouldn't be able to do it. But here we have like any old person, we say, do these jumps, jump from these surfaces, and it's the same kind of load. The duration is really, really short, but the load is still applied to the skeleton and the connective tissue. So of course we got to think about injuries. Like injuries definitely come with the territory of plyometrics. It doesn't mean we ban them and outlaw them and say nobody should ever do them, but we proceed with caution. We make sure that people are prepared to be able to do them. They have the right strength, the right not only jumping mechanics, but just as important, the right landing mechanics. How do you land after a jump? So I don't know if there's a lot of research studies on it, but I think it has face validity. And the anecdotal evidence would say, yeah, injury risk is going to be increased because the forces are very, very much increased, your margin for error in terms of technique, all of that. Um, there are people that have I don't know, there's a lot of guidelines in the books, in the textbooks and things like that. But there are people that say strength coaches that have been strength coaching for a long time or under a mentor that's been doing it for a long time that would have kind of their own general rules of the road in their head in terms of if we're going to do these plyometrics, particularly higher intensity plyometrics, we're not going to do this until you can squat 1.5 times your body weight. That's the minimum base level that you need. And I'm not saying that's the magic number, so don't write that down, don't memorize it. The point is, if you do these high intensity plyometrics that have high forces associated with them, high magnitude loading, you need to be strong enough to be able to absorb that and deal with that. As opposed to, oh, this plyometric thing seems to be all the rage. I'm going to put my beginners, these high school athletes that never strength trained a day in their life, jumping off these really high surfaces. And they might not be strong enough to be able to deal with it. And then we run into potentially overuse injuries, these repetitive stress injuries. Because the volume doesn't need to be that high when the intensity is that high, the magnitude is that high to run into trouble. And what about your biomechanics? Crucial. Again, the way you jump, if it's a jumping thing, is important, but I'd argue maybe more important is how you land. Do you jump great and when you land, your knees knock together? That's a recipe for a lot of problems. As we talked about with power training in general, things like the Olympic lifts, there's a question on the test, why does power come first? If you're thinking plyometrics, you need to be thinking quality, quality, quality. Volume can be very, very low to optimize the results. A lot of people overdo plyometrics, do too much of them. Quality is crucial with plyometrics. Who should perform plyometrics? Do your needs analysis. Like that's a term that hasn't come up yet in this class, but in every single strength conditioning book, every strength conditioning exam for a certification, the word needs analysis comes up. It's just not one I use a lot, but do a needs analysis. Does the person or the people that you're putting a program together for, do they need to do plyometrics? What are they training for? Does it involve explosiveness, plyometric kinds of actions, jumping and landing, and does it even involve like sprinting? Because again, sprinting, we get to speed training next time. Every single footfall you make is a plyometric action. High force, high magnitude loading. Who need to be explosive? A lot of sports have explosive components. Maybe some occupations, maybe depends on what you do. Some, yes, from like kind of like the tactical realm. And then like joint stiffness qualities. That was something I learned a lot under Calde's University of Minnesota. He talked a lot about joint stiffness. And the idea that we kind of talk about rubber bands being like really worn out or very, brand new the other day, and kind of think about your joint. Is your joint stiffness does not mean like muscle tightness and inflexibility. It means overall the entire joint unit is relatively stiff and doesn't experience a lot of micro movements or deformation when force is applied to it or through it. And that's good because that's a really efficient transmission of force instead of a bunch of wasted energy with maybe extra movement at the joint. And you think about over the course of a marathon, with how many steps do you take? Thousands, tens of thousands of steps. Are your joints a little bit stiffer? That might translate to a little bit better performance via a little less wasted mechanical energy. Things to think about. Principle of specificity, we've heard about that before. Probably time to be done on a nice Friday like this. So let's call that a day. We'll pick up the rest later. I'm going to put out the next set of notes, which on the syllabus says Wednesday. If this only takes us half a class for you to get finished, I'm going right into the new stuff. So be ready for that and come into the final stretch.